Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Weddings are supposed to be those once-in-a-lifetime moments when a family sets aside all its grudges and quietly agrees to stand behind the couple starting something new. But even as I stood in the center of the reception hall in my white dress with the band playing softly in the corner and the scent of roses drifting from the table arrangements, I had this gnawing certainty that my family would find a way to turn the day into another performance of favoritism. I didn't expect the curtain to rise so quickly, or for my mother to lean in close with that little smirk she saves for humiliations dressed as practicalities, and tell me in front of my husband that she and my father would be handling all the gift envelopes. She said it so casually, like she was announcing what flavor of cake had been served, and then added the part that made the blood drain from my face. Those envelopes, every one of them stuffed with cards, checks, and cash from the guests who had come to celebrate us, would be redirected to my sister Emily, because, as Mom said with an airy laugh, she'll put it to better use. The air in that room felt suddenly heavy, as if everyone near enough to hear her words was waiting for me to either explode or collapse, but I just stood frozen, the kind of frozen that comes from years of practice. This wasn't new, not really. It was just another verse in the same hymn my parents had been singing since childhood, one where Emily was cast as the chosen daughter and I was told to be the practical one, the forgiving one, the girl who needed to understand that resources had to be allocated wisely. But hearing it here, at the reception where people I loved had written heartfelt wishes and slipped folded bills into cards to help Daniel and me start our lives, made me feel like a child again, standing in a shadow so cold it burned. Emily, in her pale blue dress that she had insisted be almost as formal as mine, didn't even pretend to look embarrassed. She tilted her glass of champagne toward me with a little wink, as if she had been in on the joke long before the punchline landed. I could see that same gleam of triumph she had shown when she got a brand new car at graduation while I was handed the keys to an old sedan with two mismatched doors. It was the same expression she wore when my parents announced she'd be the one whose tuition would be fully covered, while I was encouraged to apply for scholarships and learn the value of independence. That smirk was carved into my memory long before it appeared at my wedding. For a few heartbeats, I simply let the humiliation hang there, because part of me had grown so used to it that I couldn't imagine another script. But then I felt Daniel's hand brush against mine under the table. He didn't grip, didn't squeeze, just gave me the smallest tap with his thumb that said, "We knew this was coming. Don't flinch." I turned my head just enough to see his face, calm in that infuriating way he has, like he could be watching a thunderstorm roll in and still trust the roof would hold. And that was when he leaned forward, slid a heavy envelope across the table with deliberate slowness, and said, "That's fine. We anticipated this." I will never forget the sound of the paper scraping lightly across the linen, or the way my mother's manicured hand hovered over it like she already owned whatever was inside. My father, who had been half listening and half calculating in that quiet, ruthless way he has when money is mentioned, reached forward and tore open the flap with an almost greedy eagerness. Their eyes dropped to the contents, and in an instant the self-satisfied confidence drained out of their faces. My father's jaw slackened, my mother's lips parted, but no words came. Emily leaned over, curious, her expression expectant, until she caught a glimpse, and even she recoiled as if she'd been slapped. I didn't need to see their reaction to know we had struck the nerve we had aimed for. Daniel sat back in his chair, calm as ever, watching them absorb whatever truth was staring back at them from that envelope. Guests nearby, who only moments before had been laughing at the clink of glasses, now shifted uncomfortably, noticing the sudden silence. The band kept playing, but their cheerful tune sounded strange, almost mocking. I sat perfectly still, my heart racing, but my mouth pressed into a faint smile that mirrored the one my mother had worn just minutes earlier. What was in that envelope had been years in the making. It wasn't cash, and it wasn't something that could be passed off to Emily with a laugh. It was something else entirely, something that turned the power they always believed they had over me into a weapon aimed back at them. They wanted my wedding to be another reminder that Emily was the daughter worth investing in, the one who would put things to better use. But in that moment, as they stared pale-faced at the evidence in their hands, The stage they had been directing all my life shifted beneath them. People often ask how a single moment can change everything, how a casual sentence, spoken without hesitation, can be the thread that unravels an entire history. I never believed that until that night, until my mother's smirk collided with Daniel's calm preparation. Watching the blood drain from her face, I realized we had just flipped a script they had written long before I was born. The strange thing was, even as I sat there holding my breath, I knew this moment wasn't just about revenge. It was about finally proving that I had seen through every trick, every dismissal, every time they told me, be understanding. But before you understand the full weight of what was in that envelope, you need to know how we got here, because this wasn't about one day, or one wedding, or one act of cruelty. This was about a lifetime of being told I was second best. And that, more than anything, is why the color drained from their faces when Daniel set that envelope down. If the moment at the reception felt like a trapdoor giving way beneath their feet, the floorboards had been creaking for years. Because the story of how my parents learned to measure love in receipts and signatures started when I was a teenager standing at the kitchen counter, while my mother circled ads for dance recitals and critique coaches for Emily, and my father explained that my summer job money would be more impactful if we treated it as a family fund, which meant I covered groceries. While Emily's point shoes imported from New York arrived in tidy boxes that were never discussed as luxuries, but as investments in her trajectory. I learned quickly that resistance earned a lecture about scarcity and responsibility, so instead I developed a habit that would later become my private religion. I wrote everything down, not in the bitter diary way that teenagers do, but in a plain spiral ledger with dates, amounts, and exact wording, because whenever my parents spoke about fairness, the specifics evaporated like steam, while columns and totals stayed put and stared back when you needed them to. It wasn't that Emily was a villain in a fairy tale. She was a perfectly ordinary younger sister who had absorbed the lesson that if she frowned just right the world would tilt, so she perfected the frown and let gravity do the work. And by the time we were in high school, she had a car with a temporary tag on it while I drove the hand-me-down sedan that smelled like crayons and spilled coffee. And when I asked about the difference, my mother said, with that same polite finality she would later bring to my wedding, that Emily needed a reliable image for auditions and campus tours, and I, being practical, could make anything work. I did make it work, but the ledger kept growing. A thin blue vein of numbers that recorded every bit of temporarily borrowed lunch money, every "we'll square this later" dorm deposit, every "we'll reimburse when the bonus clears" textbook purchase. Until the pages told a story that, even without adjectives, made me feel like I had been paying rent to live. In my own family, Daniel entered this slow bookkeeping opera long before he became my husband, standing beside me in a shabby post-college apartment with a wobbly dining table while I stacked bills and explained why my bank account kept looking like a tide chart. And he listened with that careful stillness that never felt like judgment, only attention, and then he asked a question that rearranged the furniture in my head. Why was I letting verbal promises erase the value of my boundaries when I could write terms? That required the kind of accountability my parents used in every other area of their lives. We didn't hatch a scheme that night. We opened a spreadsheet, one that translated the line items in my spiral notebook into clean categories: housing, tuition, transportation, family emergencies that somehow always coincided with Emily's critical opportunities, and then, because Daniel is the sort of man who believes in the power of paper with legal teeth, we attached a simple acknowledgement at the bottom of each entry, the kind you sign without thinking when a delivery arrives. The first time I used it, my mother was perched at our breakfast bar with a latte she had not asked whether she could pour, explaining that Emily's showcase had a last-minute fee that would open doors, and I said I understood, truly I did, and that I could help. Of course I could help, if she would sign this one-page acknowledgement that clearly stated the amount, the reason, and the agreed-upon date of return, with a modest late fee, not because I intended to shake down my own parents, but because a consequence made them consider time as something that belonged to me as much as to them. She stared at the page like it was a prank, then laughed, then realized I was perfectly calm, then, because she wanted the money more than she wanted the argument. She signed, not angrily, not theatrically, just with a tight smile that told me I had moved the furniture again. Word quietly spread between my parents that requests now came with paperwork, and although they grumbled about formality in a family that prided itself on being close, they signed again when the next temporary situation arose, and again when a refund was delayed, and on one unforgettable afternoon my father signed twice in the same week, shaking his head while assuring me he would settle all this soon, because he didn't want loose ends hanging around their taxes. I nodded sympathetically and filed the pages in a hard folder with tabs, not because I imagined a dramatic confrontation someday, but because I had discovered that insisting on the dignity of documentation was a form of self-respect that did not require screaming or pleading. If all of this sounds cold, I should admit that I tried kindness first, then patience, then diplomacy, and when those produced only new categories of temporary, I tried humor, which helped me survive the holidays. I made jokes about being our household's internal revenue service, about assessing an emotional surcharge on phone calls that began with "Don't panic," about how my ledger had better penmanship than any birthday card they had ever given me, and we laughed together in a way that almost felt normal, but the signatures kept accumulating and there came a point when even I had to ask whether I was building a bridge back to them or quietly paving an exit ramp for myself. Daniel said it didn't have to be either, that keeping records was a way to stay honest with people who refused to be honest with themselves, and for a while that felt like enough. Until I noticed how Emily had started to treat the paperwork as a challenge rather than a boundary, arriving with elaborate sob stories to test whether I would blink if the performance got good enough, and when I didn't, she stopped asking me and went straight to our parents, who kept signing because convenience is a habit that wears a parent mask and calls itself love. My small, private revenge during those years was never about making them hurt. It was about making the truth visible, and there was one afternoon, quiet, sunny, unremarkable, when that truth clicked into place so completely that even my father's expression shifted from indulgent to wary. He had come to return a partial amount on a stack of signed acknowledgments, a tidy bundle secured with a paperclip, and as he set it down I slid across a single new page that consolidated the balance, applied the modest late charges they had already agreed to, and, in a neat paragraph at the bottom, offered a payment plan that would keep everyone's pride intact, and he read it twice, then 3 times, then signed without saying a word. And when he looked up I could see that somewhere behind his eyes a calculus had shifted. I was no longer the child who could be convinced that family math was different from the kind the bank used. That page went into the folder. The folder went into a fireproof box. The box moved with us when Daniel and I found a place together, and when we set a date and booked a venue and ordered a cake big enough to feed 300 people who believed in our future. I added one more tab to the folder labeled with a single word that still feels both ruthless and merciful: contingency. The night before the wedding, Emily texted me a photo of a white dress so close to bridal it made my chest ache with a familiar resentment, and my mother left a voicemail about streamlining the gift table so there's no confusion, and I put my phone face down, snapped the fireproof box shut, and told Daniel that if they tried anything, we would not shout, we would not plead, we would not make a scene, we would slide an envelope across a table and let signed truth do what it always does when people who count on fog meet daylight. On the morning of the wedding I woke before the alarm, not because I was the glowing bride who cannot contain her joy, but because my brain, which had been training for this day like it was a marathon with surprise hurdles, began inventorying every point of failure with the precision of a stage manager who knows exactly which pulley will stick and which actor will miss a mark. So I lay there cataloging details until the room brightened and I could move without feeling like my own ribs were crowded. The dress hung in the window. The shoes were lined up in obedient silence. The bouquet was chilling in a hotel ice bucket like a celebrity guest who preferred solitude, and on the desk sat the small, locked card safe Daniel and I had rented with the same energy we brought to choosing a health plan. It sounds clinical to say we tested the key twice and took a photo of the lock position before breakfast, yet when you grow up in a home where sentimental moments are mined for leverage, you learn that romance lasts longer when it is supported by practical architecture, so I slipped the key into a pocket sewn under the dress lining, the seamstress's tiny rebellion that I had requested without giving her the reason, and I exhaled for the first time that morning. The church felt like a place that could keep secrets, with its wooden pews and sunlit dust, and the way people who knew both families glanced at each other as if they sensed a storm building behind the stained glass. And the ceremony unfolded with the careful elegance of something practiced, which is the truth. Our vows were not improvised. Our music was chosen to soothe rather than dazzle. And the kiss was the exact length we had decided would communicate sincerity without provoking an aunt to murmur about propriety, and yet beneath all of that choreography I kept feeling the old tug of childhood expectations, that anxious script in which I would inevitably surrender something to keep the peace. Between photos and hugs I noticed the first cues that the day would not be allowed to simply be a day, my mother instructing an usher to centralize the gift table near the exit where she could monitor congestion, my father telling the caterer that any envelopes should be rerouted to the family office for safekeeping, and Emily drifting in and out of clusters like a minor royal, her pale blue dress flirting with the boundary of the spotlight as though proximity alone might draw electricity from the stage. My first act of quiet revenge that day was not dramatic or even visible to most people, and maybe that is why it felt so right, because drama would have given them a target while subtlety gave them a mirror. When my mother requested that a decorative basket replace the locked safe because a heavy box looks uninviting, I smiled like a bride who had no particular opinion beyond wanting everything to look pretty, and then asked the venue coordinator to bring both, the basket for visual charm and the safe for actual function, and I stationed our friend Lila, who has the gentle face of an artist and the moral spine of a tax auditor, beside the setup with instructions to receive each card like a passport and slip it into the safe in full view of the giver, locking the box after every handful while cheerfully remarking that the venue's insurance required it. People nodded as though this were standard, which in a sane world it would be, and by the time my mother wandered over to consolidate the flow, she found a polite system already in place and several guests thanking Lila for doing it right, which left my mother with two options: oppose professionalism in public or drift away to plan a different angle. And I watched her choose the second with a tight smile I recognized from late-night negotiations about temporary loans. Inside the reception hall, the band kept the tempo light while the cocktail hour did its steady work of softening edges, and I breathed through the dance with my father, who murmured that he was proud in the tone of a man who wants credit for using a full sentence. And when I stepped away, Daniel caught my eyes with that almost imperceptible nod that meant something like "keep your center, we are on our marks," and I believed him because he had spent weeks refusing to let me turn paranoia into prophecy, insisting instead on contingencies backed by actual behavior. The toasts rolled out like small boats, buoyant, affectionate, occasionally wobbly, and then, as if a director had called for a tonal shift, Emily stood with her glass raised and delivered a speech so syrupy it slicked the floor, praising our journey and hinting at how family support shapes greatness, a line delivered with the same rehearsed innocence she once used to explain why my savings would unlock her internship, and the table of cousins who remembered the ledger years exchanged looks that told me I was not alone in my memory of costs rewritten as kindness. When the plates were cleared and the servers began that post-dessert ballet in which everything feels simultaneously complete and vulnerable, my mother glided to our table like a woman arriving at her preferred scene in a play she has directed for decades. And if I say she smiled, it will sound sweeter than the truth, because what she wore was the expression of someone who already knows the ending and wants to savor the path to it. She placed both palms softly on the linen, leaned close enough that only the nearest guests could hear, and, with the bright authority she reserves for decisions that affect everyone except her, announced that she and my father would be taking charge of the gift envelopes so we would not have to worry about logistics on our special night, then added that, since Emily had some important opportunities coming up, the family had decided it would be wisest to redirect the wedding gifts to her because She said this with a tinkling little laugh that made my skin go cold. She'll put it to better use. I have replayed that sentence so many times I can tell you where the band was in their set when she said it and how the candles near the centerpiece flickered as if they, too, had felt a draft. And I remember the way my throat tightened, not with surprise, but with recognition, that awful sense of a script returning to claim its lines, and for one beat I truly considered letting it pass to keep the evening from splitting in two. Yet before the old habit could root itself, Daniel reached into his jacket, drew out the envelope we had prepared with the calm of a man opening a guidebook to a country he has studied for months, slid it across the table so slowly that every eye nearby followed its white edge, and said, without raising his voice or altering his smile, that it was perfectly fine. We had expected this exact request, and they should go ahead and open it. The moment that envelope touched the white linen tablecloth, it seemed as if the room paused to inhale, a quiet intake of collective breath that no one acknowledged but everyone felt, like the hush before a storm finally breaks. My mother reached for it without hesitation, her fingers moving with the kind of entitled certainty you only develop after years of assuming that whatever you open will belong to you. My father leaned in slightly, his brow furrowing not in suspicion but in focus, as if he were anticipating some form of administrative responsibility to fall into his lap, perhaps a note outlining which account to deposit the checks into, or a polite gesture from Daniel transferring authority to the head of the family. I watched them tear open the envelope with the coordination of people who had done this before, not once or twice, but many times across the landscape of my life. For a few seconds, the mood held steady, and then everything shifted. My mother's smile faltered first, her mouth still slightly open as her eyes began darting back and forth across the top sheet. My father, slower but no less impacted, blinked several times in rapid succession, as though his vision had suddenly become unreliable. They both stiffened in their seats, their spines going ramrod straight, as if the contents of that envelope had physically shocked them into attention. Emily, curious, but already too far down the path of smug delight, leaned over to peek, and when she saw what they were holding, she let out a quiet sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a scoff, somewhere in between a child's pout and a grown woman's panic. Inside the envelope were not checks, not gift cards, not polite thank you notes or token gestures of familial deference. What my parents pulled out was a stack of printed documents, neatly arranged, each page stamped with a date, a signature, and a number. These were not dramatic declarations or scandalous secrets, but something far more effective, a precise, curated ledger of every dollar I had ever loaned them or Emily over the past 15 years. From emergency tuition support to last-minute venue deposits to bridge funding for Emily's unpaid internship, the pages told a story of debts cloaked in guilt, disguised as family crises, and never repaid. Each transaction came with a corresponding acknowledgement, my mother's signature in one instance, my father's scribbled initials in another, along with brief notes outlining the agreed terms, most of which had long since expired. But the piece de resistance, the single page that broke the spell of smug superiority and turned the entire evening on its head, was a notarized statement, prepared weeks earlier by Daniel's firm, asserting that should the balance remain unresolved, the matter would be escalated formally, with full documentation and supporting materials to be provided to a third-party mediator or legal body as required. It was not a threat in tone, nor a personal vendetta in language, but a clinical, factual document that laid out cause and consequence with the same cold efficiency my parents had used for years to justify every slight, every redirection of resources, every casually cruel remark that always ended with "you understand, don't you?" The color drained from their faces not because they feared legal trouble, although that possibility certainly loomed like a thundercloud, but because, for the first time, they were staring at their own behavior framed not in sentiment or excuses, but in black and white records, signed and dated by their own hands. There was no escape route through emotional manipulation, no convenient memory lapse to rewrite the facts, no sibling triangulation to spin the situation in Emily's favor. The truth sat in their laps like a mirror they couldn't look away from. Guests began to notice that something was wrong. A few at nearby tables craned their necks with subtle curiosity, while others quieted mid-laugh, their expressions shifting as they caught glimpses of my parents' frozen posture and the uncharacteristic silence spreading like spilled wine across our section of the room. The band continued playing, but their upbeat melody now sounded dissonant, like a movie score clashing with the wrong scene. Daniel, still seated calmly beside me, lifted his champagne flute and took a slow sip, his expression unreadable but his presence steady as ever. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than anything I could have shouted in a fit of rage, and they did it without breaking the dignity of the evening. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she tried to refold the papers, her movements jerky, uncoordinated, as if touching them now burned her fingers. My father set the envelope down carefully, almost reverently, and cleared his throat like a man about to make a speech he hadn't written. But no words came. Emily stood abruptly, muttered something about needing air, and disappeared into the hallway with the stilted gait of someone trying not to run. My parents remained seated, though they looked suddenly smaller, as if their chairs had grown in size or their own stature had shrunk under the weight of the documents. And in that strange quiet, with the chandelier light casting soft shadows across the polished table, I realized the most satisfying part wasn't the revenge itself. It was watching them process it without anyone else in the room fully understanding what had just taken place. There's a particular kind of justice that doesn't announce itself, doesn't bang the gavel or demand applause. It just quietly turns the tables and lets everyone sit in the new arrangement. That was what Daniel and I had orchestrated, not an explosion, but a reversal so complete and so clean that no one could deny it without also denying the evidence of their own choices. Still, despite the satisfaction, I felt no elation, no gloating sense of triumph. What I felt, sitting in that moment, was something far stranger, relief, not because I had finally won, but because I had stopped playing a game whose rules had always been rigged. And as I looked around the room, at the people laughing again, at the servers passing cake, at the lights flickering just slightly above the table, I realized we had one more decision to make. Because what you do after you win quietly matters just as much as how you played the hand. And we were not done yet. I had imagined many times what the moment after the reveal might feel like, thinking perhaps it would be a flash of vindication or a surge of anger. But instead it felt like standing at the edge of a lake just before dawn when the mist is still heavy and you can barely see the water's surface, only sense its depth. The reception hall, which moments earlier had been loud and almost theatrical with clinking glasses and shifting bodies, now held a quiet that was not silence, but a kind of stunned recalibration, as though everyone present was trying to understand what had just happened without having the vocabulary for it. My parents sat in front of me with the envelope and its contents spread between them like a hand of cards they had never meant to play in public, and for once neither of them reached for a script. Emily had not returned from her abrupt exit to the hallway, which left a faint, visible gap at the family table that guests pretended not to notice, and Daniel sat with one arm on the back of my chair, his expression calm but his eyes alert, like someone waiting for a signal only we would recognize. It was in that suspended moment that I realized the real question was not whether we had proven our point, because the documents had already done that with an efficiency no speech could match, but what we would do next. Because the power had shifted so decisively into our hands that a single wrong move could make it feel like cruelty rather than justice. I could see my father trying to gather himself, his jaw working as he looked down at the pages, maybe calculating damages or rehearsing a counterargument. But each time he opened his mouth he seemed to hit an invisible wall of recognition and closed it again. My mother's hands were folded neatly now, her fingers interlaced tightly enough to blanch the knuckles, and she stared at a point just above my shoulder as though it might offer her a ladder out of the hole. I had spent years fantasizing about a showdown, about finally being able to throw their hypocrisy back at them, but sitting there at my own wedding in a dress that still smelled faintly of roses, I found no appetite for spectacle. The revenge had already landed, clean and unmistakable, in front of witnesses who might not know the details, but who understood, at least instinctively, that something long buried had surfaced. What Daniel and I had prepared was not only a legal instrument, but a stage on which my parents had been forced to look at themselves without costumes, and that was more potent than any confrontation could ever be. Yet, even as I thought this, I knew we could not simply leave the moment hanging without a frame, because ambiguity without intention can rot into misunderstanding. Daniel shifted slightly beside me, signaling that it was my choice how to close the scene, and I reached for my water glass, the stem cool against my fingers, and spoke not in the tone of a daughter or a bride, but of someone stating a fact. Everything you are holding is true. Every signature is yours. Every number matches a transfer. I don't want a spectacle. I don't want to fight. I just want you to understand that I've been keeping track and that tonight, for once, is not about Emily. The words were steady, almost conversational, but I saw their effect ripple across my parents' faces because nothing terrifies people who rely on selective memory more than a calm, precise accounting. My father finally found his voice and murmured something about private family matters and misunderstandings, but even as he spoke the words sounded hollow, like furniture being moved around a room whose floor plan had already changed. My mother reached out as though to gather the papers, then hesitated, her hand hovering above them before retreating to her lap. Around us, the reception began to stir back into motion. The band picked up a new melody, guests resumed conversations in low voices, and servers carried trays of coffee and dessert past our table as though nothing unusual had occurred. But within our small circle the shift was unmistakable, and it belonged entirely to Daniel and me. I leaned slightly toward my parents and said, quietly enough that only they could hear, "This is not a threat. It is a boundary. You taught me that money equals respect. I finally decided to believe you." Then I straightened, smiled faintly, and took Daniel's hand. We stood, leaving the envelope and its contents on the table, not because we were walking away from it, but because we wanted them to sit with it a while longer, to feel the weight of their own signatures without our gaze pressing on them. We crossed the dance floor toward the photographer, who was beckoning us for another round of portraits, and as we moved I felt a strange, almost serene detachment settle over me, like a knot finally loosening after years of tension. Behind us I could hear my father whisper something to my mother, his voice low and tight, and then the soft shuffle of paper being refolded. Emily slipped back into the hall just as we reached the edge of the dance floor, her eyes red but defiant, and she gave me a look that was not apology but something closer to confusion, as if she had just glimpsed a map she didn't know existed. I met her gaze for a second, then turned back to Daniel and let the photographer position us beneath the archway of flowers. What happened after that moment is a story I could tell, but I have chosen not to, because the real power of that evening lay not in the follow-through, but in the choice to let ambiguity breathe. Whether we pursued formal repayment or simply left the ledger as a monument to truth is something only Daniel and I know for sure, and the guests who whispered about the pale faces at our table will never have more than speculation. What I can tell you is that my parents have never again asked me for a cent, never again spoken of reallocating anything for the good of the family, and that Emily has begun paying her own bills in full, though she has never acknowledged the shift aloud. Sometimes at night, when Daniel and I sit together in the quiet of our own home, he will ask me if I regret not making a public declaration, not following through with the legal path we prepared, and I always give him the same answer. It was never about destroying them. It was about ending a pattern. And as far as I am concerned, the envelope did exactly what it needed to do. What they saw inside changed everything, but I prefer to let the rest of the world wonder, because mystery, handled correctly, can be a form of freedom too.